Makunda Radha Kundi Giri Govardhan ki jai, Shri Vrindavan Dham ki jai, Mayapur Dham ki jai, Jagannath Puri ki jai, Jamuna Mai ki jai, Ganga Devi ki jai, Tulsi Maharani ki jai, Bhakti Devi ki jai, Samaveda Bhaktavrinda ki jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Looks. Today we're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're on the chapter entitled Breaking Ground. Srila Prabhupada is giving classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings on the Bhagavad Gita, and also giving morning classes. The evening program is from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. First is half an hour of kirtan, 1 hour of lecture, question and answer period, and then another half an hour of Hare Krishna kirtan. So now that there has been an increase of the number of people coming to Prabhupada's classes at 26 2nd Avenue, we are coming into a new era understanding Prabhupada's pastimes, because there are several books that have been written about these sweet times at 26 2nd Avenue. And by studying how the devotees were attracted to Prabhupada and became interested, dedicated disciples of Prabhupada at this time, we'll be able to understand better Prabhupada's struggles to incorporate and establish Krishna consciousness all over the world. So today, I have taken some excerpts from a book entitled Blazing Sadhus by one of Prabhupada's earliest disciples named Achyutananda Das. Achyutananda now lives in Alachua community, along with hundreds of other Prabhupada disciples and devotees. And he collected his memories and the lessons, the early lessons that he learned from Prabhupada. But how he became a devotee is a sample of how so many of these young men and women in America became devotees at 26 2nd Avenue. So I've taken the early times when he first met Prabhupada to see, because we're hearing all the time about this is the era of the counterculture, when the young people, although educated, they're giving up mainstream America, not taking jobs, not marrying, not taking any responsibility, and they're searching for some spiritual purpose in life. And unfortunately, one of their means of searching is through a very strong intoxication called LSD. And this is chemical. And they erroneously felt that by taking these intoxications, they would get some spiritual enlightenment. So we're starting now with when Achyutananda at this time, his name was Charles, or Charlie, or Chuck was his nickname. So he was one of these youths. He was about 18 years old at the time, and he was searching. His father had given him Bhagavad Gita when he was only 8 years old, and therefore he was studying and trying to understand Bhagavad Gita, and there were particular verses that he could not understand. He knew he needed help, but there was no one to help him understand Bhagavad Gita properly. So we're entering in just when, a few days before Charlie met Srila Prabhupada. I sat with Ryder, it's one of his friends, an intellectual who always carried a laundry sack full of books. He handed me a slip of paper about 1.5 inches long, ragged on the sides like parchment. It had a blue-green spot stain in the middle. Ryder says to Charlie, "This is Owsley acid," he said, $5, costs $5. So acid is another name for LSD, this very strong intoxicant. It's an hallucinogen. Sure, says Charlie. And then Ryder warns him, do not take the whole thing. It was just a little spot on a piece of paper. Do not take the whole thing, he said emphatically. Cut it in half, swallow it, and give the other half to a friend. So Charlie says, I plan to take it and do yoga. You know, I do yoga too. There's this Swami on the Lower East Side who's chanting. Really? I said, where? At 26 2nd Avenue around 1st Street. What is he chanting? Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Oh, I said, I never heard of that before. So Ryder explains to him, he's very different, this Swami. He'll propose a question, and people will start debating and arguing between themselves. And he just sits back and lets them talk. And then he answers the question. I needed a guide, Charlie was saying in the book. I remembered what Ryder had told me about the Swami who chants Hare Krishna at 26 2nd Avenue. That evening, I started off for the Swami's place. I arrived at 26 2nd Avenue and looked in the window. It had been a small store, about 15 feet wide and 20 feet to the back wall. From the glass entrance all the way to the back wall was only 20 feet. From within, I heard brass cymbals clanging in a 1-2-3 beat. Above the front window was a sign, Matchless Gifts. The former business sold scented candles, incense, and probably matches. It was all gutted and cleared out now. Nothing significant had ever happened in this store. If those walls could talk, we'd be bored to death. He's a wonderful writer and has a wonderful sense of humor, Achyutananda. His classes would be so interesting because he came here with Prabhupada. Everyone thinks that Prabhupada just came with Keith or Kirtanananda when Prabhupada became sick. But a month later, Prabhupada arranged for Achyutananda to come, that's Charlie, and Prabhupada kept him in India from 1967 all the way through until Srila Prabhupada disappeared. So he was here, he learned Bengali, he learned Hindi, he traveled all over India preaching, and this was just the beginning, how he met Prabhupada. A black spot on the linoleum floor was once a piece of bubble gum, now a permanent fossil. In the window were 3 brick-colored hardbound books and a typewritten note card scotch-taped to the glass that read, Srimad Bhagavatam translated from the original Sanskrit with elaborate commentary by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. I was intrigued that the word Vedanta was in his title. So in America, they have, just like here in India, you have the habit of people chewing pan. And in the corners, you'll see red and all these dirty things that people spit out. So in America, they have their habits too, and they chew gum. Just to keep themselves from eating too much, they'll chew gum, and they'll spit it out on the floor. And all over the public places, you'll see these wads of gum that can never be picked up off. There's some countries like Singapore, it's against the law to spit out gum because they want their country to be very clean. You have to pay a fine if you spit out gum on the floor, on the ground. But in America, there was no such law, so these permanent fossils of gum, you'd find them all over America on the pavements, in the trains, everywhere. A young couple standing next to me was also looking in the window. We could hear the muffled sound of hand cymbals and drums. I joined my palms together and asked them, "Is this 26 Second Avenue?" Giggling, they said, "Pilgrim, your search has ended," and walked away. So we're hearing in the Hindi class that whenever Prabhupada gave his classes, he would make sure that the door would be kept open so that anyone who was attracted to hearing the cymbals and the chanting and the drums, they could easily walk in. So they heard it, but they were just looking in the window. Charlie, he wanted to go in, but the couple walked on. I went into the store. Sitting on the bare floor were about 25 men and women in their mid-20s and 30s, playing cymbals and chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. One fellow looked like a Hebraic Paul Bunyan in overalls. Okay, now this is something that no one in India will understand. Hebraic comes from the word Hebrew, which means Jewish, just like we're hearing about Israel nowadays. It's a race of people, the Jews. So this big person, Paul Bunyan, we have in India, we have beam, powerful beam. So in America, they have also their folklore and their heroes. And one of them, his name is Paul Bunyan. No one knows if he was a real person or not. But according to folklore in America, he and his blue bull, they had so many different activities that created the lakes in America and the Grand Canyon by pulling logs through the mountains, all the different landscape in America. They have these stories about how Paul Bunyan, this powerful beam, American beam, and his blue bull created all these landscapes in America. So who Charlie was talking about was Brahmananda. Because Brahmananda was very strong. Later on we'll hear Prabhupada was remembering that Brahmananda used to be able to pick up 100 pounds of rice and carry them up the stairs. 100 pounds is equivalent to 160 kilos. All by himself, he could pick that up. So that was the first person that Charlie noticed when he went in, because he was so powerful, sitting and listening to Prabhupada. A young woman was dressed modestly. That was Jadharani, the artist of Prabhupada. Now, Prabhupada, over the years, he will remember all these earliest devotees and reminisce about the nice, sweet times, the happy times that they had in 26 Second Avenue. And one gentleman looked like a conservative accountant. He was one. So Prabhupada, by that time, he had collected a few working people, not just hippies. So Prabhupada explains that the people who were coming to his classes, they were educated. They all had good educations. If they wanted to, they could have had very good jobs. But they were interested in spiritual pursuit. And therefore, most of them were jobless and poor, but they would come and listen to Prabhupada. Some of them had jobs. Like, for instance, Brahmananda. He had a job, and he was a school teacher. And he would give his entire salary to Prabhupada. Every month he would get $400. He moved into 26 Second Avenue. After the classes, the boys would just sleep on the bare floor. They'd put down blankets, and they'd sleep there. So with those $400, Prabhupada was able to pay the rent of the storefront and Prabhupada's apartment. And then Steve Guarino, who later became Satsvarup, he also gave money to Prabhupada. So those who were working, Prabhupada encouraged them to continue their work because they needed support in order to carry on their preaching work. I sat in my most perfect lotus posture and joined in the chanting. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. At the far end, seated on a straw mat on the floor, playing hand cymbals and chanting Hare Krishna was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. His head and face were shaved, and the simple saffron robes he wore were not hemmed, but torn off at the edges. So there are different rules and regulations for sannyasis. And if one follows them strictly, one of them is that they should not wear sewn clothing. So they just tear their clothing according to... Achyutananda later explained that when they came here to India, when Prabhupada, he went back to America, he established a few more temples. Then in 1970, he came back with the World Sankirtan Party. And the first big pandal they had was in Delhi at the LIC grounds. Before the big LIC building was constructed, it was just a big flat grounds. So in order to make the pandal, you know how a pandal is made, there's cloth around the frame. So after the pandal, Prabhupada had just recently given Achyutananda sannyas at that time. So he took the cloth from the pandal and tore it up to make enough sannyasi robes for 1 year for himself. And then he dyed it all with the rocks. The devotees learned how to survive here in India. So they used the pandal cloth for their dhotis and their dupa, you know, their urdi. So he noticed all of these details about Prabhupada. No sewn clothes. On his forehead and nose was a pale yellow mark of 2 vertical lines that extended from between his brows to his hairline. I thought this must allude to his third eye or his Agya Chakra. So because Charlie had been studying yoga, different types of yoga, Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, reading the Bhagavad Gita, he was studying about chakras and about the yoga process. He didn't understand yet the meaning of tilak. Later when he went to India, because when Prabhupada came back to America, Prabhupada told him to go live in the Gaudiya Math under the care of Prabhupada's godbrothers. So he learned many things living in the Gaudiya Math. It was he who wrote, the first year after he took sannyas, the book that we all still use called Songs of the Vaishnava Acharyas. That was compiled by Achyutananda Swami. And I'm mentioning this because he learned at that time, long after he first noticed Prabhupada's tilak, according to the Gaudiya Math, they taught him that the 2 lines are Radha and Krishna, and this is a leaf, a tulsi leaf at Krishna's lotus feet. So in the beginning, we're just hearing what he first noticed. And later, as you read his book, we find out how Achyutananda, he discovered what the meanings of all these things were. So this book goes right alongside of the Prabhupada Lilamrita, but seeing one devotee's view of what was going on, what Satsvarup Maharaj will be explaining in his Prabhupada Lilamrita. His eyes were closed in concentration, and he looked like he had the wisdom of the Prime Minister of the galaxy. Such a beautiful description of Srila Prabhupada. The chanting, or Sankirtan, lasted for another 10 minutes. Then the Swami solemnly recited some Sanskrit prayers and began his talk. His 70-year-old voice had the tone and timbre of a cello. Does anyone know what a cello is? A cello is, we know what a violin is? So a cello is a violin that's about this big. And when you play it, it has a very mild and deep sound. So that was the only thing that Achyutananda could compare Prabhupada's voice to. Very deep, grave sound of a cello. After his talk, he cut up an orange, and a bearded disciple, who looked like Jesus in jeans, passed the pieces around on a plate. I leaned toward a bearded, long-haired man in black jeans. So this long black-haired man was Hayagriva. At that time, his name was Howard Wheeler, and he was no intellectual slouch. At the age of 28, he was the youngest professor of English to hold tenure at the University of North Carolina. So this is Howard Wheeler, Professor Howard Wheeler, but when he was coming to visit Prabhupada, we had heard last week how he just by chance met Prabhupada on the street. And Prabhupada took him to see the 26th 2nd Avenue, and Prabhupada invited him to bring his friends to the classes. So now Howard was attending these classes regularly. So this is some of the things that Prabhupada said that night in the class. The great sage Narada Muni says, Sarvopadi Vinir Muktam. Of course, no one in his audience could understand Sanskrit, but Prabhupada still gave the Sanskrit. And that was very impressive for the young people, because everything that Prabhupada said, he was able to pinpoint the sloka or the verse that he was speaking from. This really impressed them because they could understand Prabhupada was not just imagining answers. He was speaking exactly according to the scriptures. Mukti means liberation, liberated from all these bodily designations. You are thinking, I am American, Indian, or Japanese. I am white or black, young or old. These are all bodily conceptions of life. It is temporary illusion. I have seen in front of your United Nations building, and there are so many flags, because we can remember Prabhupada had a friend, Mr. Bogart, and he would invite Prabhupada to the peace vigils at the United Nations. The devotees were allowed to come there. The devotees went there to chant kirtan, knowing that that was the greatest cure, the real peace formula. But the UN official says, no, this is a silent peace vigil, so they would just be able to sit and chant their japa. So Prabhupada would go there regularly for these peace vigils and also to see Mr. Bogart, who had his office at the UN Plaza, just nearby the UN main office. When there will be one flag, then you can say the world is united. If there is to be a brotherhood of man, there must be a fatherhood of God. Just as the material body has a spirit soul, so the whole material creation has a soul. That is Krishna. The chanting of Hare Krishna cleanses the mirror of the mind. So long as our consciousness is dirty, no plans for world peace or any peace is possible. So then Charlie leans over to Howard, the long-haired person sitting next to him, and he says, well, that solves all the world's problems. And Howard says, yeah, and that's just the beginning. Charlie asks, you know the Swami? I've been coming for a few months. He was Professor Howard Wheeler, later initiated as Hayagriva. No intellectual slouch at age 28, he was the youngest professor of English to hold tenure at the University of North Carolina. So in the universities, sometimes they will have guest professors or they will have assistant professors. They'll come and give a lecture on a particular topic. But if you get tenure, that means you are a permanent professor and you can go on for many, many years, and you get a sabbatical. That means every 7 years you can go and do research and write a book. It's a very, very commendable position in a university, and it usually takes many years to prove yourself. And here was Professor Howard Wheeler at age 28 only. He already had his tenure. So after the lecture, the Swami left through a side door. I went home. I went in to meet the Swami in private. I would tell him about my yoga experiences. It must be difficult for a 70-year-old holy man living alone in New York. Maybe I could help him. It might be a nice supplement to my yoga practice. I didn't know how naive my ambitions were, because he was just seeing Prabhupada thinking he was all alone. Meanwhile, Prabhupada, he had already a following. I went to the temple every week. On one visit, after we chanted Hare Krishna, the Swami explained how chanting is as natural as a young baby's crying for its mother's love. Then the Sankirtan started again. So Prabhupada saw that he understood, just like when he was living at the Bowery, and mostly the artists and the musicians were coming, and they were enjoying the music, but they couldn't grasp the meaning of the Maha Mantra. Now here at 26 2nd Avenue, he had a different group of young people. They were searchers, they were interested in spiritual life, and he wanted to bring them into the meaning of chanting Hare Krishna, have them experience this spiritual relationship with Krishna through sound vibration. So he explained that this is just like a baby crying for one's mother, when you're chanting Hara to mother, and then calling out to Krishna and Ram, begging for service. Then the Sankirtan started again. We went beyond the meditative mood, and this time we wailed. Hands in the air, people outside the window peeked into the room, mouths open, thinking something had happened, something good, or somebody did something great. Somebody did. And then the Swami stood up, raised his arms, and swayed along with us. Amidst the chanting and the clanging of cymbals, I asked Professor Howard, chanting and swaying next to me, "Are we ever going to sit with the Swami and meditate?" He leaned over and said, "Never trust a holy man who can't dance." So that's the subtitle of Achyutananda's book. Time did not matter. Nothing else mattered except Hare Krishna chanting. We were melting into the mantra, and we were raising the roof. So they were getting a spiritual experience finally, simply by this chanting of Hare Krishna. So this was just a little example, just like if you have a pot of rice, and you want to know if the rice is ready, you just have to take out one grain, feel that grain. If it's ready, then you know the whole pot is ready. So Achyutananda's story, how his friend gave him some acid, and that little piece of paper with the acid on it, from that experience, the exchange of an intoxicant, he said he was going to use it for increasing his yoga experience. His friend introduced him to where Prabhupada was chanting. He went, and he was completely mesmerized by the chanting. So that's just the example of one person who became a dedicated follower of Prabhupada. In the first initiation, he hadn't joined yet. That was on Janmashtami of this same year. 15 days later, on Radhastami, he got initiated by Prabhupada. 4 devotees were initiated then: Brahmananda, Achyutananda, Kirtanananda, and Satsvarup. So this chanting of Hare Krishna was able to purify his mind so quickly. Within 15 days, he felt ready to take initiation. So now we're going to continue the reading of the Lilamrita. And last week, we were right in the middle of an adventure. Prabhupada was giving a lecture, and a drunken man came into the room, and he starts saying, "How are you?" And Prabhupada says, "Do not disturb." So then he walked out, and we heard about how he smelled, how dirty he was. So after the man walked out of the room, Prabhupada chuckled. He laughed, and he used that example of the man in his lecture. And this is the example Prabhupada gave. There is a story about how habit is second nature. There was a thief, and he went on pilgrimage with some friends. So at night, when the others were sleeping, because his habit was to steal at night, he got up and was taking someone's baggage. But then he was thinking, oh, I have come to this holy place of pilgrimage, but still I'm committing theft by habit. No, I shall not do it. So then he took someone's bag and put it in another place, and for the whole night, the poor fellow moved the bags of the pilgrims from here to there. He didn't want to steal, but he moved everyone's luggage all around while the people were sleeping. But due to his conscience, because he was on a holy pilgrimage, he did not actually take anything. So in the morning, when everyone got up, they looked around and said, "Where's my bag? I don't see it." And another man says, "I don't see my bag." And then someone says, "Oh, there is your bag." So there was some row. So they thought, what is the matter? How has it happened? Then the thief rose up and told all of the friends, "My dear gentlemen, I am a thief by occupation, and because I have that habit to steal at night, I couldn't stop myself. But I thought, I have come to this holy place, so I won't do it. Therefore, I placed one person's bag in another man's place. Please excuse me." So this is habit. He doesn't want to, but he has a habit of doing it. He has decided not to commit theft anymore, but sometimes he does, habitually. So Krishna says that in such conditions, when one who has decided to stop all immoral habits and just take to this process of Krishna consciousness, if by chance he does something which is immoral in the face of society, that should not be taken account of. In the next verse, because in the previous verse that Prabhupada was speaking about, he was saying that one who takes to this process, that he's saintly, he's dharmatma, he's to be considered saintly even if there's some temporary fall down. So then Prabhupada quotes the next sloka from the Bhagavad Gita, 9:31. Last week we heard 9:30. Krishna says, "Kshipram bhavati dharmatma." Because he has dovetailed himself in Krishna consciousness, it is sure that he will be saintly very soon. So the translation, now Prabhupada had not printed his Bhagavad Gita yet. He was trying to get it printed, but no one was interested. Mr. Bogart was trying to help him, and some of his early students from when he lived up at 72nd Street, they were trying to help him, but no one was willing to publish Prabhupada's book. So Prabhupada would take the translations of Dr. Radhakrishnan, who was an impersonalist. He said that the translations of the slokas were good, but do not read the purports, because they will misguide you, because they were impersonal. For instance, Dr. Radhakrishnan said, "It is not to Krishna whom we should surrender to, it is the unborn within Krishna that we should surrender to." So Prabhupada would take his translations at this time, until his Bhagavad Gita was printed, from the Dr. Radhakrishna translations. Now later, in Achyutananda's book, Achyutananda, he gives little clippets of things that were very important to him that he heard from Prabhupada. And one of them was that a young woman asked Prabhupada, "If God is so good and so great, why is there so much suffering in this world?" And Prabhupada gave the example, just like here, the thief. Now the thieves come out at night when the sun goes down. So is it the fault of the sun that there's a thief at night? No, when the sun goes down, the thieves come out. The sun has disappeared. So God, Krishna, it's not his fault if there's suffering in this world. When Krishna is not in our life, when he's not visible to us, when we're not following his instructions, then naturally there will be suffering. It's not God's fault. It's because we choose not to have God in our life. Just like when the sun goes down and there's darkness, then the thieves come out. It's not the fault of the sun. It's the habit of the thief. So Krishna says that in such conditions, when one who has decided to stop immoral habits and just take to this process. So Prabhupada used the example of that drunkard within his lecture. Suddenly the old derelict returns, announcing his entrance. How are you? He is carrying something. He maneuvers his way through the group, straight to the back of the temple, where the Swami is sitting. So the door is where the shoes are. You walk into the door and everybody keeps their shoes. We had a picture of that a few weeks ago. Then you walk in and you sit down, and Prabhupada is sitting here, way at the other side. So he walked all the way up to where Swamiji was sitting. He opens the toilet room door, puts 2 rolls of bathroom tissue, that's toilet paper, inside, closes the door, then turns to the sink, sits some paper towels on top of it, and puts 2 more rolls of bathroom tissue and some more paper towels under the sink. So here was this derelict, this drunk. He saw that something very nice was going on. Though by habit he was a drunkard, when he saw that something spiritual and religious was going on, he naturally wanted to do some service. He went out, he got all these things from who knows where, he brought them in, and in the middle of the class, he did his service. He then stands and turns around towards the Swami and the audience. The Swami is looking at him and asks, "What is this?" The bum is silent now. He has done his work. Prabhupada begins to laugh, thanking his visitor, who is now moving towards the door. Thank you very much." The bum exits. Just see, Prabhupada now addresses his congregation. It is a natural tendency to give some service. Just see, he is not in order, but he thought that here is something, let me give some service. Just see how automatically it comes. This is natural. So we'll read later on. Later, the drunkard comes back, and that time he's cut his hair, he's cleaned himself up, he's in clean clothes, and he sits down in the audience. So this is the effect of chanting Hare Krishna. Just like Prabhupada, many of these young boys who came to him, they were dirty. We'll hear at the end of the class. The boys that came to stay in the room after Prabhupada had his class, Prabhupada would allow these young boys who they were homeless, they had no money, no home, he would allow them to sleep on the floor of the storefront. And gradually, some of them, though not all of them, were interested in the philosophy. They were also interested in the food that Prabhupada would feed them and the fact that they had somewhere to sleep at night. But some of them, they became interested and they became Prabhupada's disciples. So though they started out dirty, long hair, disheveled, gradually by hearing from Prabhupada, by chanting Hare Krishna, they became purified. The young men in the audience look at one another. This is really far out. First the chanting with the brass cymbals, the Swami looking like Buddha and talking about Krishna and chanting, and now this crazy stuff with the bum. But the Swami stays cool. He's really cool, just sitting on the floor like he's not afraid of anything. Just talking his philosophy about the soul and us becoming saints, and even the old drunk becoming a saint. After almost an hour, the dog still barks and the kids still squeal. So outside, Prabhupada had 3 things he had to deal with. One was a big dog who lived in the neighborhood who barked constantly. The other were the little children, the Puerto Rican girls, it was summertime, summer vacation. They lived there, so they would be out on the streets screaming and squealing, playing their games, and they would especially like to come to the door and screech in the door, and Prabhupada would send someone to shoo them away. And then the traffic, all the traffic on 2nd Avenue. But when the chanting was going on, all of these things disappeared. As soon as the chanting stopped and Prabhupada started his lecture, many of the people in the audience stood up and walked out the door. The chanting was over, they had come for the chanting experience, and they weren't interested in the philosophy. But the serious ones stayed, despite all of the outside noise. Prabhupada is asking his hearers, who are only beginners in spiritual life, to become totally dedicated preachers of Krishna consciousness. So here we have 3 devotees. The one who's playing the veena, the tambura, that's Keith or Kirtanananda. The one who's playing the harmonium, that's Achyutananda. Because as soon as he experienced the chanting and went up and spoke to Prabhupada a few times, Prabhupada invited him to stay. And he was invited to shave off his long hair. He hadn't cut his hair in 1 year. He immediately shaved his head, and he became a full-time follower of Srila Prabhupada. And behind him is Hayagriva. So it was, the effect of this chanting of Hare Krishna was quite rapid. These young people, within a few months, they dedicated themselves to Srila Prabhupada. They were able to take initiation. In the Bhagavad Gita, you will find that anyone who preaches the gospel of Bhagavad Gita to the people of the world is the most dear, the dearest person to Krishna. Therefore, it is our duty to preach the principles of this Bhagavad Gita to make people Krishna conscious. Prabhupada can't wait to tell them, even if they aren't ready. It's too urgent. The world needs Krishna conscious preachers. People are suffering for want of Krishna consciousness. Therefore, each and every one of us should be engaged in the preaching work of Krishna consciousness for the benefit of the whole world. Lord Chaitanya, whose picture is in the front of our store, has very nicely preached the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. The Lord says, just take my orders, all of you, and become a spiritual master. So now Prabhupada's even telling them they should become spiritual masters. Lord Chaitanya gives the order that in every country you go and preach Krishna consciousness. So if we take up this missionary work to preach Bhagavad Gita as it is, without interpretation and without any material motives behind it, as it is, then Krishna says it shall be done. We should not have any attraction for worldly activities. Otherwise, we can't have Krishna. But it doesn't mean that we should be inimical to the people of the world. No, it is our duty to give them the highest instruction that you become Krishna conscious, and then suddenly there's a break. Now, when Prabhupada came back to India, one of his godbrothers challenged him that if Lord Chaitanya wanted the world to become Krishna conscious, then why didn't he travel all over the world? And Prabhupada answered him, he said, that is because he wanted me to get the glory. Because Prabhupada took the instructions of his spiritual master so seriously, he had 100% faith that if I take this chanting of Hare Krishna, the teachings of Lord Chaitanya to the Western worlds, certainly they will become Krishna conscious. And he was now trying to convince others to assist him in his mission. So Prabhupada's lecturing, and suddenly a man stands up. A young man in the audience seems unable to contain himself and begins making his own incoherent speech. Prabhupada, no, you cannot disturb just now. Man standing up. Now wait a minute, man. A quarrel begins as others try to quiet him. Prabhupada, no, 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 not just now. No, you cannot ask just now. Man, well, I am trying to talk. Prabhupada, no, just now you cannot ask. Prabhupada was trying to keep them disciplined. Man, but wait a minute, man, wait. Prabhupada, why do you interfere just now? We have a regular question time. Others in the audience, now they were taking sides. Let the man finish. Yeah, let him talk. The man's supporters defend his right to speak, while others try to silence him. Second man, I have just one question, please. How long is an individual allowed or expected to go on without any type of thought? How long? Prabhupada, I am not finished. We'll give question time after finishing the talk. The parties go on quarreling. All right, I'm very glad you are curious, but please wait. Have some patience because we have not finished. As soon as we finish, after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I will tend to your question. Don't be impatient. Sit down. The audience quiets down, and the Swami goes on with his talk. After 5 minutes, Prabhupada, all right, this gentleman is impatient. We shall stop here. Now, what is your question, sir? Man, practically we tend to place emphasis on those we identify with the fact itself. Many people are meant to explain the why-fors and the wherefores of the metaphysical truth that I think, therefore I am. Prabhupada, what is your particular question? Man, I have no answer to that question. Rather, but that I attempt, I live, I breathe. Prabhupada, yes. Man, so ability. Tell me why I have nothing to do with it. May I understand the why-fors and the wheres? Prabhupada, that's all right. Man, I have difficulty in you. I have difficulty in saying. Prabhupada, so long as we are in this material world, there are so many problems. Prabhupada's trying to pacify this madman. Man, not many problems. It is not many problems. This is the greatest fact. I know. Yes, man. I also know the whys and wherefores of my particular Prabhupada. Yes, man. I didn't come here, but let me explain my position. This isn't necessarily, I feel I must. I think the difference is to learn. You'll find it innumerable times by the same token. Maybe we are able to reconcile the fact of individual being for a long time to find out why. Prabhupada, turning to one of the boys, Roy. Can you answer his question? It is a general question. You can answer, yes? Roy turns sympathetically to the rambling questioner, and Prabhupada addresses his audience. Enough questions. His voice now seems tired and resigned. Let us have kirtan, because this is Prabhupada's program, and this is always the way we carry on our programs. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he cautioned his disciples that when you have a program, if you're invited somewhere, you go there and you should ask for a remuneration. They should give a gift to you. Otherwise, you can invite them to come to our place, to our temple, and they can hear you for free. So when we would do programs, Prabhupada set up a formula for us. We would go to a place, we would have first kirtan, then we would have a lecture, then we would have another kirtan, and then we would have prasad distribution. Anywhere we went, we would follow this formula. And Prabhupada himself followed this formula. First he had the kirtan, then the lecture, now the second kirtan, and then he would distribute, he would cut up an apple or an orange and distribute that to the guests. And the Lower East Side once again abates. The chanting begins, the brass cymbals, Prabhupada's voice carrying the melody, and the audience responding. It goes for half an hour and then stops. It is now 9 o'clock. The audience sits before Swamiji while a boy brings him an apple, a small wooden bowl, and a knife. As most of the audience sits still sits and watches, gauging after effects of the chanting as though it had been some new drug, the Swami cuts the apple in half, then in fourths, then in eighths, until there are many pieces. He takes one himself and asks one of the boys to pass the bowl around. Swamiji holds back his head, deftly pops a slice of apple into his mouth without touching his fingers to his lips. He chews a bit, ruminating, his lips closed. Now, some of the disciples noticed when Prabhupada would do this, because we just heard Prabhupada was at the end of the room. Next to where Prabhupada was sitting was a sink. So when Prabhupada ate, he would never touch his mouth. He would pop things into his mouth, whatever it was. Roti, rice with sabji, never, or he would sometimes use a spoon. But he would never touch his fingers to his mouth. And when you're eating an apple, there's skin. He would perfectly spit that skin so that it went right into the sink. And everyone thought it was a mystic power that he could so perfectly spit into the sink. The members of the congregation munch silently on little pieces of apple. Prabhupada stands, slips into his shoes, and exits through the side door. As Prabhupada retired to his apartment and his guests disappeared through the front door back into the city, Don and Raphael would turn out the lights, lock the front door, and go to sleep on the floor in their blankets. Don and Raphael had needed a place to stay when they heard about the Swami's place. Prabhupada had a policy that any boy who expressed even a little interest in becoming his student could stay in the storefront and make it his home. Of course, Prabhupada would ask them to contribute towards the rent and meals, but if, like Don and Raphael, they had no money, then it was still all right, provided they helped in other ways. Don and Raphael were the first two boys to take advantage of Prabhupada's offer. So when Prabhupada was go up to his room, he had an altar, he would do puja, he would be typing on his typewriter, and the two boys would take care of the storefront. They were attracted to Swamiji and the chanting, but they weren't serious about his philosophy or the disciplines of devotional life. They had no jobs and no money. Their hair was long and unkempt, and they lived and slept in the same clothes day after day. Prabhupada stipulated that at least while they were on the premises, they could not break his rules. No intoxication, illicit sex, meat eating, or gambling. He knew these two boarders weren't serious students, but he allowed them to stay in hopes that gradually they would become serious. Often some wayfaring stranger would stop by, looking for a place to stay the night, and Don and Raphael would welcome him. An old white-bearded Indian turned Christian who was on a walking mission proclaiming the end of the world and whose feet were covered with bandages once slept for a few nights on a wooden bench in the storefront. Some nights, as many as 10 drifters would seek shelter at the storefront, and Don and Raphael would admit them, explaining that the Swami didn't object as long as they got up early. Even drifters whose only interest was a free meal could stay, and after the morning class and breakfast, they would usually drift off again into Maya. So this was a program that actually Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted to start in London. He wanted what was called a hostel, and that is where these drifters could come and spend the night. We would feed them prasadam, and then they would hear some philosophy. So Prabhupada was actually able to start that for the first time, 26 Second Avenue. Now we also have that program in London. This is the last frame. Donald and Raphael were the Swami's steady boarders, although during the day they also went out, returning only for meals, sleep, and evening chanting. Occasionally they would bathe, and then they would use the Swami's bathroom up in his apartment. Sometimes they would hang out in the storefront during the day, and if someone stopped by asking about the Swami's classes, they would tell the person all they knew, which wasn't much. They admitted that they weren't really into the Swami's philosophy, and they didn't claim to be his followers. If someone persisted in inquiring about the Swami's teachings, Don and Rafa would suggest, why don't you go up and talk to him? The Swami lives in the apartment building out back. Why don't you go up and see him? So Gargamuni, he explains that when he moved in, they had nowhere to bathe. They would have the sink there, and they would just wash themselves down. But sometimes they would go up and bathe in Prabhupada's bathroom. So in 1975, when Prabhupada, he came back to Calcutta, he was walking, he would take his morning walks at the Victoria Memorial sometimes with his disciples. And Achyutananda Swami was with him one morning. And Prabhupada was reminiscing about these times in 1966. So Prabhupada said to Achyutananda, that was where we started. You remember Mukunda got me the storefront and the apartment? There was that nice small garden where we took prasadam sometimes. We all used one towel. So Achyutananda explains that there were 6 boys living in the storefront. And there was only one bathroom upstairs, Prabhupada's bathroom. And Prabhupada had a towel. See that blue towel? Prabhupada had one towel. And each one of the 6 boys, after Prabhupada used it, they would use that one towel to dry off with. That's how poor everybody was in those days. So Prabhupada was remembering that. Sorry. Here it is. We all use one towel. You were cooking. When I had the heart attack, you helped me. When Prabhupada had his stroke, Prabhupada called in Achyutananda and he was massaging Prabhupada's heart, which saved him. Raymond was doing the printing. Brahmananda was working. He one time carried 100 pounds rice bag up the stairs. Jadharani was painting. Gargamuni was eating. Because Prabhupada would have the devotees make prasadam for whoever was there. So Gargamuni's service then was eating. He was very young. There was some struggle, but it was sweet. So we'll go on next week, continuing Prabhupada's times at 26 2nd Avenue. Hare Krishna. Jai.